Hello, I'm Frank Hutchison.
And I'm Meredith Hutchison Hartley.
And I'm Emily Geddes.
And welcome to the Hidden History of Business podcast.
Today we're going to talk some more about disruption, or rather, what's not disruption. And specifically today we want to take a look at the sharing economy, this disruptive effect that's going through our society that is knocking down big companies and allowing the upstarts to take over the world.
Or something like that.
Something like that. So this started, we've discussed in a couple of other episodes, I found CNBC's 2015 Disruptor 50 list, where they list the 50 most disruptive companies. And if you can't tell with the sarcasm and frustration in my voice, I'm really not impressed. As we've discussed, we are overusing this word disruption and innovation to mean smaller and smaller things. What we consider disruptive really isn't changing the way people live. It's really not having a meaningful global effect on people. It's changing how one industry views itself. And I think we see that. I really went in and I looked at the description CNBC uses, and they describe these companies as ones that are creating new ecosystems for their products and services by unseating corporate giants, which is no easy feat. They're venture capital-backed companies. And this is the part that killed me. They said, already it's hard to think of the world without them. In their top 5, so number 4 and 5, are Uber and Airbnb. If you aren't familiar with these companies, Uber and Airbnb are part of this new sharing economy, which really means that regular people who aren't running official businesses use these companies to sell things or services they have. In the case of Uber, it's a ride. People can drive in their car, and someone can use the app to call for a ride just like you'd call for a taxi, and whoever is available will go pick them up, drive them somewhere, and they get paid for doing that. Same thing with Airbnb. You have people who have apartments or even just a room in their home, and they can post it on Airbnb, and folks can say, yeah, I want to rent it for this date, pay, boom, they've rented a room.
Gee, I've never done any of those before.
Oh, no, never. Obviously, Uber and Airbnb invented this. Ugh. This is so frustrating for me because they say it's already hard to imagine the world without them. Most of the world doesn't have Uber.
Nope.
And most of the world doesn't have Airbnb. Or, as we see here, SpaceX, Dropbox, Warby Parker, we've discussed in other episodes, SurveyMonkey. What we're really seeing here is that these are companies that are using a different business model than is normal in their industry. Uber isn't your standard taxi company. And a normal taxi company, the company owns the car, and their taxi drivers have to actually rent the car from them for as much as $40,000 a year. The company takes care of maintenance on the vehicle and everything else. And then they pay the taxi driver wages. The taxi driver also gets tips. Uber works a little differently. Now, Em, you had your first Uber ride just a couple months ago.
I did, in Salt Lake while we were there for the Parliament of the World's Religions.
That's right.
We were about a mile away from the center, and sometimes the weather was nice and we just walked. It's not that far, but sometimes the weather was cold and blustery and rainy, and so we called for an Uber. And it was really convenient. It was 2 seconds on your iPhone, and then 5 minutes later, a very clean, polite, well, the car wasn't polite. Let me try again. A few seconds later, a very clean car would pull up exactly where we were waiting with a very polite, nice driver, made conversation for the 5 minutes it took to get us to where we were going. And
maybe $4.
Yeah, it was very convenient.
It was, but it's not exactly a new idea. People have been sharing rides and giving people lifts for money for all of time.
Well, you look back in history, travel, especially outside of your local community, was dangerous. I mean, there were thieves, there were robbers, the story of the Good Samaritan, traveling and he gets waylaid. You had a lot of situations where people would gather together and journey together so that they'd have the safety in numbers.
You also have people who were traveling and just let other people hitch a ride.
They do.
If you were carrying a load of hay into town in your wagon, you might let someone hitch a ride on the back of your wagon, either for free or let them pay you.
They would.
Shipping merchants did this. Yeah. Vikings allowed people to hitch rides. Not only were they international business tycoons, but if someone was going where they wanted to go, even though they were a cargo ship, yeah, they'd let them jump on and take take a ride for a fee. We see it in the Silk Road repeatedly. People traveled by paying a caravan that was going somewhere. Or someone would ride up on a horse and you say, hey, will you give me a ride somewhere? Here is money. And people would do that. So Uber isn't really doing anything that is logistically new. People have always been doing this. We have this weird blip in modern history in Europe and the US where it hasn't been as popular for concerns about safety, but it's always been happening.
Yes.
And the same goes for Airbnb.
An Airbnb is the idea of you have this room or even your whole house and that you will rent it out to somebody for a short period of time. But if you go back in history, that's nothing new. For example, 20 years ago, I was transferred from Washington, D.C. down to Newport News, Virginia. It was going to be another 3 months before my family moved down there. And so for that period, I could have either gotten a hotel room or what I did is through some contacts, is I found someone who had an empty bedroom that they were willing to rent to me for that period of time. Turned out to be a lot cheaper than a hotel room, and it was convenient, and it was clean and safe. So that's what I did.
And that's just a recent example. Throughout history, travelers have stopped at local houses and said, hey, do you have a room or a spot by the fire? Can I give you a couple coins? Can I stay here with you? Or people have said, do you have any chores you need done around the house? In fact, it was extremely common in medieval and Renaissance Europe, especially poor travelers, to stop at a local inn and say, what can I do to earn my supper? And that could be anything from, if you had a good singing voice, literally singing for your supper to amuse the patrons of the tavern or the pub. It could be doing dishes. It could be cleaning stables. It was whatever service you could provide in exchange for food or room and board.
Well, and there were also, especially in the Old West, many women in particular would take in boarders, would take in lodgers for a fee as a way to support themselves.
And in fact, we have the letters that my grandfather wrote to my grandmother during the Great Depression. And in it, he talks really about both of these concepts, where his parents ran a dry farm in an obscure town in southern Idaho, but he went to school in Logan, Utah at Utah State University. But he also worked in different towns earning money during his off seasons. So he would rent a room from someone when he was up in Idaho taking care of the sheep. He would rent a room through network connection while he was down in Logan going to college. Also, the family only had one car that had to be shared among 3 adult boys. And his letters are full of him saying, I think I can get the car Friday night. Oh no, I couldn't get the car. Woody has it. I'm going to try to hitchhike down to you. And that was an accepted mode of transportation in the 1930s. And it was considered relatively safe because generally you knew at least 6 degrees of separation most of the people who were going to be driving that way. So he literally hitchhiked 100 miles easily on a regular basis. And he would just hand over some money for gas and people were happy to take people.
Over and over again. And so what's really new about Uber or Airbnb?
Well, nowadays, one of the value-added propositions that they have on both Uber and Airbnb is they do offer some level of background checks, some level of verification that the Uber driver and the Uber passenger or the Airbnb renter and rentee are okay people. Now, that isn't 100% foolproof. There have been some stories in the news lately of Uber passengers who were violent or Airbnb renters that destroyed the room that they were renting. But that is a value-added proposition.
The other thing that's different is that nowadays you can go online and you can find reviews for both the rooms and the locations as well as for the driver. That's something we've added. But again, historically, that was done by word of mouth.
They go to the local tavern or church or center and say, hey, who can I rent a room from? And the word of mouth was right there in the square. Or you would walk into the tavern and say, hey, who can give me a ride to this place? And they'd say, oh, so-and-so is going. And everyone knew you were going to this place, which meant that if you disappeared, people would come asking. In fact, we see this. There are a couple of cases of prolific serial killers on the American frontier. People were pretty easily able to connect them to these repeated deaths because everyone knew that someone had left a tavern going to their house to find a room and they disappeared afterwards. So there were still checks and balances for safety, even without a digital app to get that information.
That's true.
The other real big innovation, the thing you could actually say is different about the sharing economy, is that someone else is getting a cut cut of the action. In the past, you would pay whoever was giving you the ride directly. You would pay whoever was renting you the room directly. Now, you click a button on your app, you pay a larger company, which is the middleman. They take their cut before paying the other person. And I think that's really the euphemism we use when people are saying disruption. They're not really saying this has changed the world as we know it. They're saying someone has figured out a way to make money off of what people had been doing individually in the past without actually doing it themselves. We see that with Uber. Uber isn't actually owning the cars. They treat all of their drivers as independent contractors, which is actually pretty controversial. So they don't actually have any of the operation costs, but they get a cut of every ride. Same thing with Airbnb. They provide the platform for people to accept payments, to advertise their business, to receive reviews, and they take a cut of every single payment. That's really the innovation we're talking about here. So be aware of that when you hear people calling some of these companies disruptive, or this whole idea that it's hard to think of the world without them, because there may be these economic juggernauts now, but they're doing what people have always done, which means even if Uber disappears, people are still going to find a way to collaborate and share to get things done.
Yes. When I was in college, it was the bulletin board in the student union.
Oh, the ride share board.
The ride share board, yes.
Right. And same thing, the room share board. That happened all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't do that anymore. We do it online.
But the thing is, even if Uber didn't exist, people would still have ride shared boards.
Yes.
They would still use word of mouth to find a place to stay.
That's right.
Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.
If you liked this episode, consider leaving us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or social media. You can find snark, updates, and behind-the-scene peeks of production on Twitter. Our handle is @HiddenBiz. That's @HiddenBiz. You can also find us on Facebook as The Hidden History of Business. Music for this podcast is from the album Time Within Itself by Michael Waldrop and used with permission of the artist. You can find out more about it on iTunes and Amazon. If you'd like to access show notes and multimedia content and the periodic rant from your hosts, be sure to visit our website at www.hiddenhistoryofbusiness.com.